Every year brings big releases, but not all anticipation comes from hype alone. Some games stand out because they're doing something different, shifting tone, reworking familiar formulas, or taking creative risks that don't always come easy. Many of these projects have taken longer than expected. Some have been reshaped behind the scenes. Others carry weight because of the studios and creators attached to them. Together, they give us a clearer picture of where games are heading next. These are the most anticipated titles worth watching. Resident Evil Requiem is easily one of my most anticipated games of 2026, and it feels like Capcom is finally ready to circle back to what made this series so special in the first place. This is the 9th mainline entry directed by Koshi Nakanishi of Resident Evil 7 game, and it's doing something pretty bold by returning us to the ruins of Raccoon City, roughly 30 years after everything went down. What makes Requiem really interesting is its dual protagonist setup. You'll be switching between Grace Ashcroft, a new FBI technical analyst who's very much out of her depth, and Leon S. Kennedy, who really needs no introduction at this point. Grace's sections lean heavily into stealth-driven survival horror, sneaking, hiding, managing noise, and scraping by with limited resources, while Leon brings that more action-focused energy that fans will immediately recognize from the later games. Gameplay lets you swap between first-person and third-person perspectives, which is a nice touch depending on whether you want pure immersion or a clearer view of the action. It's also worth noting that this was originally pitched as something very different before Capcom pivoted hard back to a full single-player experience, and honestly that feels like the right call. The tone looks properly tense again, especially with smarter enemies and environments that feel hostile rather than empowering. I'm also really curious to see how far they push the emotional side of this one. There's been some teasing that this could be Leon's final major outing, and if that's the case, Capcom has a real opportunity to give the character a meaningful send-off rather than just another mission.
I've been watching you. You're not like other people, you know. You're quite unique.
Tell me what's going on.
Something important.
Mom, I'm scared.
Grace. They're coming.
Here we've got Nioh 3 taking the number 19 spot, and honestly, this one feels like Team Ninja doubling down on everything their fans already love. This is the third entry in the Dark Samurai action RPG series, and if you've played the previous games, you know exactly what you're signing up for here. Brutally precise combat, yokai-infested historical Japan, and a difficulty curve that does not care about your feelings. This time around, you play as Tokugawa Takechio, heir to the shogunate after an ambush at Edo Castle sends Japan spiraling into supernatural chaos. The story leans into that familiar Nioh blend of real history and myth, with time-warped eras, legendary figures, and plenty of betrayal along the way, but it's really just the framework for what matters most, the combat. Gameplay-wise, Nioh 3 is pushing things forward in some interesting ways. Missions are less rigid and more open, with larger fields to explore, hidden bosses, and side encounters that feel more organic than before. The big change, though, is the ability to freely switch between samurai and ninja styles mid-fight. Samurai keeps that classic Nioh power fantasy with stance switching, key pulse management, and heavy-hitting weapons, while the ninja style is faster and trickier, leaning into mobility, tools, and evasive play. Mixing the two looks like it's going to open up a lot of build variety. There's also more movement this time, jumps, wall runs, stealth takedowns, which gives combat a slightly different rhythm compared to earlier entries. Multiplayer is back as well, with both summoning for boss fights and full co-op expeditions, so you're not forced to suffer alone unless you want to. What's really nice is that Team Ninja is letting players get hands-on early. A free demo drops on January 29th, complete with character creation, online co-op, and full save carryover into the main game, which is a pretty confident move. If it feels good there, that hype is only going to grow. Here we have Ace Combat 8 Wings of Theve, and this one feels like Project Aces going straight back to their comfort zone in the best possible way. This is a full return to the Strange Hero universe, bringing with it that signature mix of arcade-style flight combat, massive skies, and emotionally charged pilot drama that the series is known for. Set after the events of Ace Combat 7, the story once again leans into large-scale geopolitical conflict, with new factions entering the spotlight and a fresh war erupting across the skies. You're thrown into the role of a weapons systems officer who unexpectedly inherits a legendary call sign, leading a squadron through carrier-based operations and high-stakes sorties. As always with Ace Combat, the narrative isn't just background noise, it's delivered through radio chatter, squad dynamics, and those quiet moments between missions that give the conflict some real weight. Gameplay-wise, this is very much an evolution rather than a reinvention. Dogfights are fast, explosive, and readable, with a strong emphasis on situational awareness and positioning. One of the big focuses this time is the sky itself, with multi-layered cloud systems that aren't just visual flair but actually affect combat and tactics. Maps are larger and more realistic in scale, making engagements feel less like arenas and more like full-on air campaigns. There's also a stronger squad element here. Wingmen matter more, commands play a bigger role, and performance in combat feeds back into how your squad responds to you over the radio. Add in cinematic first-person sequences and a renewed focus on pilot perspective, and it looks like Project Aces is really trying to sell the fantasy of life in the cockpit. I'm glad they're not overcomplicating things too. This still looks and feels like Ace Combat. Not a sim, not a looter, just pure refined aerial action with a bit of melodrama layered on top. If Ace Combat 7 worked for you, this feels like a very confident next step rather than a risky departure.
Start swimming, soldier. Make it home alive.
Let's keep at it, Rex.
Ray, heads up!
On your orders, Rex.
To keep hope alive, Wings of Theve must stay on the mission. Must fly on.
I can make up your kill count to be whatever.
Right. From now on, you'll be the greatest ace pilot this war will ever know.
Here we've got Onimusa Way of the Sword, and this one feels like Capcom finally reopening a door a lot of fans thought was sealed for good. This is the first brand new mainline Onimusa game since Dawn of Dreams back in 2006, and rather than reinventing the series, it looks like Capcom is deliberately sharpening what made it special in the first place. Set in Edo-era Kyoto, the game tells a standalone story twisted by supernatural malice clouds that flood the city with Genma demons. You play as a young, rough-edged take on Miyamoto Musashi, very much portrayed as a raw blood and mud swordsman rather than a polished legend. After a near-death encounter, he's bound to the sentient Oni Gauntlet, which gives him the power to fight back and pulls him deeper into a world of demons, rival warriors, and underworld intrigue. Gameplay is firmly third-person action, and importantly, it's not trying to be a Souls-like or an open-world RPG. Levels are mostly linear, with branching paths, side objectives, and puzzles, and the real focus is on deliberate cinematic sword combat. Fights emphasize timing, positioning, and reading enemy intent, with parries and stamina breaks opening enemies up to brutal finishing moves. It looks slower and more methodical than something like Nioh, but also far more grounded in pure blade mastery. The Oni Gauntlet plays a big role beyond combat, letting you absorb souls for healing and upgrades, unleash powerful abilities, and reveal hidden demon realms through Oni vision. There's also a surprising amount of environmental interaction, from tactical positioning to situational executions, which gives encounters a bit more variety than simple arena fights. What really stands out to me is how confident this all feels. Capcom isn't chasing trends here, it's leaning into atmosphere, animation quality, and tactile swordplay, all powered by the RE engine. It feels very intentional, almost like a statement that Onimusa still has its own identity in a genre crowded with imitators.
New ways controlling this lightning.
I don't have time for these stupid games.
I'm terribly sorry. Anyway,
Next up is the Blood of Dawnwalker, and this one is instantly interesting just because of who is making it. This is the debut project from Rebel Wolves, a studio formed by key developers behind The Witcher 3, including director Konrad Tomaskevich and several other senior creatives who helped define CD Projekt Red's golden era. Because of that, expectations are already sky high, and honestly the comparisons feel earned. Set in a plague-ravaged, 14th century-inspired Europe, the game drops you into a world collapsing under war, disease, and superstition, just as vampires begin openly seizing power. You play as Cohen, a family man turned Dawnwalker, caught between humanity by day and vampirism by night. There's a hard ticking clock here, 30 in-game days to save your family, and what's interesting is that doing nothing is just as much a choice as charging headfirst into chaos. Gameplay leans heavily into what made The Witcher 3 special, but with some bold twists. This is a narrative sandbox rather than a traditional main quest-driven RPG. Quests don't sit above one another in importance. The world reacts aggressively to your decisions, and even major characters can be killed, permanently reshaping how the story unfolds. Combat looks more physical and directional, mixing grounded swordplay with much more aggressive vampire abilities once night falls. The day-night cycle isn't just visual either. During the day, you're gathering information, negotiating, and surviving as a fragile human. At night, the rules change, traversal opens up, combat becomes faster and more brutal, and hunger becomes a moral problem you have to solve. Feeding choices matter, and the game doesn't seem interested in clean good or evil answers. What really sells this, though, is confidence. Rebel Wolves isn't trying to make a safe debut. This feels like a studio saying, we know why people love The Witcher 3, and now we're pushing that philosophy further. The world is smaller than Witcher's continent-spanning maps, but far denser and more reactive, and that focus could end up being a huge strength.
I don't know. How?
I am life. I am death. I am everything in between. I have been watching your little valley. Pestilence, famine, killing, blood spilled carelessly like water. Things will be different now. For all of you.
What if someone decided to make an RPG so large it practically throws everything but the kitchen sink into it? That's kind of where Crimson Desert sits right now. This is Pearl Abyss's massive open-world fantasy action RPG, and after a very long development cycle, it finally feels like something genuinely ambitious rather than just vague. You play as Clive, a mercenary leader caught up in a collapsing world filled with warring factions, political intrigue, and outright chaos. The story leans heavily into personal loss and survival, but it's framed within a much larger conflict that spans the entire continent. It feels very much like a character-driven narrative dropped into a world that doesn't stop just because you're not there. Gameplay-wise, Crimson Desert is hard to pin down, and that's kind of the point. It's open world, it's fantasy, and it mixes cinematic melee combat with exploration and a frankly ridiculous number of side activities. One moment you're locked in a brutal sword fight, the next you're hunting, fishing, climbing, gliding, or stumbling into some dynamic world event that wasn't marked on your map 5 minutes ago. Combat looks fast and physical, with dodges, parries, grapples, and big flashy encounters against monsters that tower over you. But it's not just about fighting. The world itself feels like it wants to keep you busy, whether that's through environmental traversal, survival-style systems, or just sheer curiosity pulling you off the main path. I'll be honest, this is one of those games where I'm equal parts excited and cautious. The scope is enormous, and when a game promises this much freedom and content, execution is everything. That said, if Pearl Abyss manages to pull it all together, this could be something really special rather than just another oversized open world.
To Providence. For those who have died, for those who have survived, and for those who will live on, this is our mission.
Next up is Pragmata, and I'll be honest, this is one I've had my eye on for a long time. Capcom first announced this game about 5 years ago. It disappeared into development limbo for what felt like forever, and now it's finally real. Because of that, I've very much got my fingers crossed for this one, especially since it's a brand new IP, and we absolutely need more of those to succeed. Pragmata is a single-player sci-fi action-adventure set on a hostile lunar research station, starring an unlikely duo, Hugh, a gruff spacefarer in a bulky spacesuit, and Diana, a small but expressive android companion. Stranded on the moon and surrounded by rogue AI, the story leans into that buddy cop dynamic, mixing quiet emotional moments with strange, high-concept sci-fi ideas. Gameplay is where things really get interesting. You're effectively controlling both characters at once. Hugh handles movement, jetpack traversal, and gunplay, while Diana hacks enemies and systems in real time through a grid-based minigame that plays out during combat. Enemies are often invulnerable until Diana cracks their defenses, so fights become this constant balancing act between shooting, dodging, positioning, and puzzle solving on the fly. It sounds overwhelming on paper, but early impressions suggest it's surprisingly approachable, with a forgiving learning curve and very smooth performance. The RE engine work is obvious here too. Everything looks crisp, responsive, and polished, even during chaotic encounters. There's also a heavier focus on exploration and environmental interaction than you might expect, which helps break up the action nicely. What I really want from Pragmata is for it to stick the landing. Capcom taking a risk on a weird original sci-fi idea like this deserves support, and if the full game delivers on what the demo is teasing, this could end up being one of those sleeper hits people talk about years later. Next up is Control Resonant, and this one feels like Remedy swinging bigger than ever. This is the follow-up to 2019's Control, but it's designed as a standalone experience, so you don't need prior knowledge to jump in. That said, if you know Remedy, you already know this isn't going to be a straightforward sequel. This time, the focus shifts to Dylan Faden, Jesse's brother, in a reality-warped version of Manhattan that's buckling under paranatural forces spilling out from the oldest house. The story leans hard into identity, trauma, and cosmic weirdness, with Dylan fighting not just hostile entities but his own fractured sense of self. It sounds very Remedy dense, unsettling, and deliberately abstract, and that's clearly the point. The biggest gameplay change is the move away from pure gunplay toward a melee-focused action RPG. Combat now revolves around a shape-shifting weapon that can morph into heavy crowd-control tools or faster precision blades, backed up by elemental powers and environmental manipulation. It still looks kinetic and chaotic, but much more physical and close quarters than the original game. Exploration also takes a big step forward. Instead of the tightly structured interiors of the oldest house, you're navigating open-ended zones across a distorted Manhattan, with gravity-defying streets, branching paths, optional quests, and reality glitches that can completely alter how areas behave. Progression seems deeper too, with skill trees and choices shaping how Dylan fights and how much of his humanity he holds onto. What really stands out is the ambition. Remedy has been very open about this being their largest project to date, both in scope and budget, and it feels like they're using Control Resonant to push the Remedy-connected universe further into something bold and interconnected rather than playing it safe. Coming in strong is 007 First Light, and honestly, this feels like one of those match made in heaven projects. You've got IO Interactive, the studio behind Hitman, taking on James Bond, and rather than playing it safe, they're going all in with a full origin story. This is a standalone reimagining of Bond, set in the modern day, where you play as a much younger, rough-around-the-edges 26-year-old version of the character. He's not the polished super spy just yet. He's reckless, resourceful, and very much earning his place inside MI6 as the story builds toward that iconic license to kill. It's a fresh angle and one that gives the narrative a bit more room to breathe than the usual Bond already knows everything setup. Gameplay is exactly where you'd expect IO Interactive to shine. Missions are built as large, sandbox-style spaces, giving you plenty of freedom in how you approach objectives. Stealth, disguises, social manipulation, and environmental creativity are all front and center, very much in the Hitman tradition. At the same time, there's a much heavier emphasis on cinematic action this time around. Set-piece chases, gadget-driven encounters, and moments where things inevitably go loud. Combat looks more physical too, with brutal melee exchanges, precise gunplay when the situation escalates, and gadgets straight out of Q's workshop to tip the odds in your favor. You're encouraged to play Bond your way, smooth and subtle, or messy and aggressive, and the game seems happy to let you live with the consequences of that choice. I'm really glad IO took the extra time on this one. The delay feels like a smart move rather than a worrying one, especially for a project carrying this much expectation. If they can balance Hitman's systemic depth with the spectacle and pacing people expect from Bond, this could be something genuinely special. Marvel's Wolverine is easily one of the most talked about games on the horizon, and it marks a very different direction for Insomniac Games compared to their Spider-Man work. This is a standalone, single-player action-adventure built from the ground up for PS5, and it's very clearly aiming for a darker, more mature take on Logan. The story follows Wolverine as a haunted, volatile figure dealing with the consequences of his past and the loss of control that comes with his berserker nature. Rather than leaning into quips or superhero spectacle, this looks like a much more grounded and personal narrative, spanning multiple locations and pulling in familiar enemies who aren't afraid to push Logan to his limits. Gameplay is where this really separates itself. Combat is entirely focused on close quarters brutality, built around Wolverine's adamantium claws and healing factor. Encounters are fast, aggressive, and deliberately messy, with parries, finishers, and a rage system that rewards relentless pressure rather than evasive play. It looks less like a superhero power fantasy and more like a raw brawler, where staying on the offensive is the only way forward. Exploration and progression appear to support that tone as well, with more contained but highly detailed environments, strong use of verticality, and upgrades tied closely to Wolverine's abilities rather than gadgets or tech. Insomniac's polish is still very much present, but it's being applied to something far more visceral than what we're used to from them. I still want to see more extended gameplay before getting too carried away, but everything shown so far suggests Insomniac understands exactly what makes Wolverine work as a character, and more importantly, what shouldn't be softened or sanitized. Next up is Saros, and this is Housemarque doubling down on what they do best, while clearly trying to push things further than Returnal ever did. If Returnal was their breakout moment, Saros feels like the game where they refine that identity into something more confident, more narrative-driven, and a little more forgiving without losing the edge. Set on the eerie, eclipse-shrouded planet of Carcosa, Saros follows Arjun Devraj, a relentless enforcer searching through the ruins of a lost off-world colony. The story is much more front and center this time around, unfolding through cinematics, dialogue, audio logs, and surreal sequences that dig into themes of sacrifice, obsession, and what it actually costs to build a future from failure. It still has that Housemarque ambiguity, but there's a clearer emotional through line than before. Gameplay is best described as Housemarque's idea of a bullet ballet. It's fast, fluid third-person shooting built around dodging, parrying, and mastering enemy patterns until everything clicks into that flow state they're so good at creating. A big addition here is a stronger sense of permanent progression. Death still reshapes the world. Biomes, enemies, and paths can all change, but you're now able to upgrade your loadout, suit, and weapons in lasting ways, meaning every run pushes you forward rather than resetting you completely. Combat looks intense but readable. Projectiles can be parried back at enemies, shields absorb fire to power devastating abilities, and bosses are designed to feel cinematic rather than purely punishing. There's also a built-in second chance system that revives you once per run, which should take a bit of the sting out without removing the tension entirely. What I like most about Saros is that it doesn't feel like Housemarque trying to reinvent themselves again. Instead, it feels like a studio saying, we know what works, now let's make it deeper. The roguelike structure is still there, but it's wrapped around stronger storytelling, clearer progression, and a slightly broader appeal.
Madness reigns. Then everything begins again. But after every death, I always come back stronger. I know that you are here, and I will find you.
Here we've got Phantom Blade Zero, and this one feels like it's arriving with a lot of momentum behind it. Developed by S-Game Studio, this is a stylish Wokafaya action RPG that's been turning heads largely because it looks nothing like the usual Western fantasy template, and just as importantly, it's making a point of not being another straight Souls-like. Set in a twisted Ming-era-inspired world known as the Phantom World, the game blends classic Chinese martial arts with steampunk machinery, forbidden techniques, and a layer of dark fantasy. You play as Soul, an elite assassin framed for murder and hunted by his own order, only to be revived with a brutal limitation, a fixed lifespan measured in days. That ticking clock adds constant pressure to the narrative, pushing you forward as you hunt traitors, uncover conspiracies, and decide what kind of ending you're willing to fight for. Combat is the real hook here, and this is where Phantom Blade Zero separates itself from Souls-likes. It's fast, fluid, and aggressively stylish, leaning far more toward choreographed wuxia cinema than methodical stamina management. Parrying, dodging, teleporting, wall running, and chaining long combo strings are all central, with an emphasis on momentum rather than punishment. You're not cautiously circling enemies, you're overwhelming them, stealing weapons, and adapting mid-fight. Exploration sits in that semi-open middle ground. Zones are interconnected and offer multiple paths, hidden bosses, and side quests that directly influence the story's outcome, but it's not trying to be a massive open world. Progression is flexible, with a wide range of weapons and phantom arts pulled directly from defeated enemies, letting you tailor your build without forcing you into a single playstyle. The name Phantom Blade Zero fits perfectly too. It suggests something sharp, fleeting, and deadly, a weapon that appears, strikes, and vanishes before the enemy can react. That idea runs through the entire game, from its combat philosophy to its world design and tone. Rather than chasing the Souls formula, Phantom Blade Zero feels like it's carving out its own lane, one rooted in speed, spectacle, and martial arts mastery. If it delivers on that promise, this could end up being remembered not as another Souls-like, but as one of the most distinctive action games of 2026.
are you?
Here we have Clive Barker's Hellraiser revival, and this one immediately stands out just by virtue of what it's pulling from. Hellraiser isn't a franchise that gets treated lightly, and the fact that this is positioned as a revival rather than a loose spin-off suggests a much more serious horror-first approach. This is a single-player horror experience rooted firmly in Clive Barker's original vision. Not just gore for shock value, but psychological dread, obsession, and the terrible cost of curiosity. The focus is on atmosphere and tension rather than power fantasy, with the Cenobites and the Lament configuration treated as existential threats, not boss fight fodder. It's very much leaning into the idea that opening certain doors is a mistake you don't get to undo. From what's been shown and described so far, gameplay appears to prioritize slow-burn survival horror. Expect deliberate pacing, exploration-heavy environments, puzzle-solving tied to forbidden knowledge, and moments where avoidance is far smarter than confrontation. Combat, when it exists, looks restrained and desperate rather than empowering, which feels absolutely right for Hellraiser. This isn't about fighting monsters, it's about enduring them. What I find most interesting is the tone. Hellraiser Revival seems committed to making the player uncomfortable in quieter ways, distorted spaces, unsettling sound design, and moral pressure rather than constant jump scares. It feels closer to psychological horror than action horror, with the Cenobites functioning more like inevitable consequences than traditional enemies. The name Revival fits too. It implies a return to the core themes that made Hellraiser unsettling in the first place: desire, punishment, and the thin line between pleasure and suffering. If this game respects that balance, it could end up being one of the more mature horror experiences in the modern space. There's still a lot we don't know yet, but Clive Barker's Hellraiser Revival is shaping up to be one of those horror projects where tone and restraint will matter far more than spectacle. If it sticks to its roots, this could be something genuinely disturbing in the best possible way. Few upcoming games carry as much quiet expectation as Judas, largely because this is Ken Levine's first major project since BioShock Infinite. It's a single-player, story-driven experience that immediately signals a return to heavily authored worlds, player choice, and uncomfortable moral questions, all hallmarks of Levine's past work. The game is set aboard a vast, deteriorating starship drifting through space, designed as a self-contained society that's slowly collapsing under its own ideology. You play as Judas, a deeply unreliable protagonist, navigating a web of competing factions and powerful artificial intelligences, where loyalty is conditional and every decision reshapes how the world treats you. Trust isn't just fragile here, it's actively discouraged. Gameplay blends first-person shooting with systemic interaction, but the real focus is on narrative reactivity. Characters remember what you do, relationships shift dynamically, and the story adapts not just to your choices but to how consistently you make them. It feels less like branching dialogue trees and more like a pressure system where the game constantly tests your values. What separates Judas from other narrative shooters is that it doesn't seem interested in giving you clean outcomes. Choices come with long-term consequences, alliances fracture without warning, and the game leans hard into themes of control, manipulation, and personal responsibility. It's very much in conversation with BioShock's ideas, but without simply retreading them. I'm cautiously excited about this one. Levine's ambition has always been his strength and his risk, and Judas looks like another project that's aiming high rather than playing it safe. If it sticks the landing, this could be one of those rare single-player games that people are still debating years after release. There's a lot riding on Marvel 1943 Rise of Hydra, and not just because of the characters involved. This is Skydance New Media's big debut, led by Amy Hennig, best known for shaping the early Uncharted games, and that pedigree alone sets expectations for something heavily cinematic and story-driven, rather than a typical superhero brawler. Set during World War II in Nazi-occupied Paris, the game brings together an unusual lineup of Marvel heroes. Captain America teams up with Azuri, the Black Panther of the 1940s, alongside supporting characters like Gabriel Jones of the Howling Commandos, and a Wakandan spy named Nanali. The setup leans into tension and mistrust as much as heroics, with alliances forming under pressure rather than instant camaraderie, which feels very much in line with Hennig's strengths as a writer. Gameplay is built around a single-player narrative experience, with missions that let you switch between the 4 playable characters. Each one brings a distinct playstyle: Cap's shield-focused brawling, Black Panther's agile stealth and claws, Jones's tactical gunplay, and Nanali's spy-focused gadgets and infiltration. Levels are designed to be dense and vertical, encouraging exploration through war-torn streets, interiors, and rooftops rather than wide-open spaces. What's still a bit of a question mark is how much freedom the game actually gives you, moment to moment. We've seen hints of branching dialogue and narrative choices, but extended gameplay has been kept tightly under wraps so far. The emphasis, at least from what's been shown, seems to be on cinematic set pieces, character interaction, and atmosphere rather than deep systemic combat. The delays are worth mentioning too. This has been pushed back multiple times to give the team room to fully realize their vision, and while that's usually a good sign creatively, it does mean expectations are now very high. People want to see how this actually plays, not just how it looks. John Carpenter's Toxic Commando wears its influences proudly, and that's exactly why it stands out. This is a 4-player co-op FPS built as a love letter to old-school action horror, with Saber Interactive leaning hard into the kind of chaotic, buddy-driven carnage that made games like Left 4 Dead so memorable, just with a lot more sludge, vehicles, and 80s attitude. The setup is wonderfully pulpy. A failed experiment to tap the Earth's core unleashes an eldritch entity known as the Sludge God, mutating the world into a toxic wasteland crawling with undead hordes. To fix the mess, a mad scientist recruits a ragtag group of mercenaries, the Toxic Commandos, and sends them straight into the apocalypse. The tone is unapologetically goofy and gory, backed by Carpenter's signature horror flair and synth-heavy atmosphere. Gameplay is all about co-op chaos. You and up to 3 others drop into semi-open maps packed with objectives, side routes, and enormous waves of enemies powered by Saber's swarm tech. Gunplay is fast and punchy, melee weapons like katanas are just as viable, and teamwork is constantly rewarded through revives, ammo sharing, and coordinated crowd control. It's designed to feel overwhelming in the best way possible. One of the more fun twists is the emphasis on vehicles. You're not just on foot here, you'll be jumping into armored trucks, mounting heavy weapons, and literally plowing through hordes, which gives encounters a very different rhythm compared to most horde shooters. Classes and progression systems add replayability without turning it into a full looter grind, keeping things focused on moment-to-moment fun. What I like most is that Toxic Commando doesn't pretend to be something it's not. This isn't a serious horror game, and it's not a competitive shooter either. It knows it's about ridiculous co-op moments, exaggerated violence, and surviving impossible odds with friends while everything explodes around you. It still feels a little strange to say out loud, but Halo Campaign Evolved is finally bringing one of gaming's most iconic campaigns to a whole new audience. This is a full Unreal Engine 5 remake of the original Halo Combat Evolved campaign, rebuilt from the ground up with modern visuals while keeping the core structure that made it so influential in the first place. The focus here is entirely on the single-player experience. You're stepping back into Master Chief's boots as humanity's last hope against the Covenant, fighting across vast ring-world landscapes that helped define console shooters in the early 2000s. The story remains intact, simple, clean, and mythic, but everything around it has been modernized to make it feel at home in 2026. Gameplay looks like a careful balance between old and new. The classic sandbox combat is still the backbone, with wide-open encounters that let you choose how to approach fights using vehicles, weapons, and positioning rather than scripted solutions. At the same time, there are subtle updates to movement and controls to smooth things out for modern players without turning it into a completely different game. Visually, this is where the biggest leap happens. Unreal Engine 5 brings higher fidelity environments, improved lighting, and more detailed character models while still trying to preserve the tone and scale of the original levels. The ring world feels vast again, not just because of nostalgia, but because the tech finally matches the ambition those levels always had. One important thing to note is what this isn't. This is not a multiplayer relaunch or a live service reboot. Online multiplayer is staying separate, which makes it clear that this project is about preserving and reintroducing Halo's roots rather than reinventing the franchise. For longtime fans, it's a chance to revisit a foundational campaign with fresh eyes. For newcomers, it's arguably the best possible entry point. Resonance, a Plague Tale legacy, feels like a natural next step for the series, rather than a simple continuation. This is a Sobo studio expanding the A Plague Tale universe while deliberately shifting focus, using the same dark historical tone but telling a new story that stands on its own. Set years after the events of the earlier games, Resonance explores a world still scarred by plague, superstition, and fear, where the echoes of the macula haven't truly faded. Instead of retreading Amicia and Hugo's journey directly, the game reframes the legacy they left behind, how knowledge, trauma, and forbidden power continue to ripple outward long after the immediate crisis ends. Gameplay builds on the series' stealth survival foundations, but it looks more flexible and reactive this time around. Stealth remains central, especially when navigating hostile towns, soldiers, and environments overwhelmed by rats, but there's a stronger emphasis on problem solving, environmental manipulation, and player choice. Encounters feel less scripted and more systemic, encouraging experimentation rather than strict trial and error. Narratively, this still leans heavily into what A Plague Tale does best: intimate storytelling set against overwhelming catastrophe. Relationships, moral compromise, and the cost of survival take center stage, with quieter moments doing just as much work as the larger spectacle. The pacing looks more measured, allowing tension to build gradually instead of relying purely on shock. What I find most interesting is the idea of legacy here. Resonance doesn't seem interested in escalating things just for the sake of scale. Instead, it asks what happens after the myth, after the miracle, after the horror, and how people live with consequences they can't fully escape. Lords of the Fallen 2 feels like Hexworks coming back with something to prove. The first game had ambition, but it also launched rough, and to the studio's credit, they didn't abandon it. Months of constant patches, balance passes, and systemic fixes steadily turned Lords of the Fallen into a far better experience than it was at release. This sequel feels very much built on the lessons learned there, rather than pretending those problems never existed. Set a century after the original, the world of Mornstead is now fully split between two bleeding realms: Axiom, the dying land of the living, and Umbral, a grotesque underworld that's no longer just a penalty space, but a place of real power and opportunity. You play as a new lamp-bearer, wielding the Umbral lamp to shift between realms instantly, revealing hidden paths, enemies, and entire layers of the world without loading screens. It's not just a gimmick this time, it's the core of exploration and combat. Combat looks more confident and more aggressive. It's still very much a Souls-like, but pacing, readability, and responsiveness appear noticeably improved. Parries, executions, dismemberment, and movement all feel tighter, and encounters are built to push momentum rather than encourage overly cautious play. Bosses are massive and theatrical, leaning into spectacle without losing that sense of threat. What's encouraging is how much emphasis Hexworks is placing on refinement. Enemy behavior, progression balance, co-op integration, and build variety all seem designed to avoid the frustration points players ran into before. Full co-op with shared progression is back, and it's being positioned as a feature rather than an afterthought, which suggests the systems are being designed with multiplayer in mind from the start. I'm also glad to see the studio embracing feedback rather than dodging it. The post-launch support for the first game showed a willingness to listen, adjust, and improve, and Lords of the Fallen 2 feels like the result of that long-term iteration rather than a rushed reset.
But should you fall, the world falls with you.
Directive 8020 feels like Supermassive Games deliberately pushing their anthology in a new, riskier direction. This is the fifth entry in the Dark Pictures anthology, but instead of haunted towns or ancient ruins, it launches the series straight into deep space, and that shift alone gives it a very different tone from what came before. The story is pure sci-fi paranoia. With Earth on the brink of collapse, the scout ship Cassiopeia is sent to survey a distant planet as humanity's last hope. When a catastrophic breach releases a shape-shifting alien organism on board, the crew is thrown into a nightmare where anyone could be the threat. The setup leans heavily into mistrust, body horror, and isolation, with the tension coming not from constant violence but from not knowing who or what you're standing next to. Gameplay still carries Supermassive's signature DNA, but it's evolving in some meaningful ways. You're given more direct control this time, with third-person exploration focused on sneaking, hiding, and avoiding an adaptive enemy rather than fighting back. Combat is rare and dangerous, which helps preserve that helpless, survival horror feeling. Choices remain central, branching the story toward multiple endings, but new systems let you revisit key decision points without restarting everything from scratch. What stands out is how much effort seems to have gone into immersion. Seamless transitions between gameplay and cinematics keep the tension intact, and the tools you use, scanners, door wedges, improvised defenses, reinforce the idea that survival is about caution and awareness, not firepower. It feels less like watching a horror movie play out and more like actively trying not to make the wrong move. The delay into 2026 is worth noting, but in this case it feels understandable. This is clearly Supermassive attempting their biggest tonal shift yet, and if that extra time helps the new mechanics and pacing land properly, it could end up being a smart call.